The morning air at Forward Outpost Echo carried the heat early, mixed with the stale tang of fuel and fine desert grit. Canvas panels of the operations tent flapped lightly as Rachel moved through the entryway, her boots leaving shallow prints in the hard-packed dust. The folding chairs inside were already half filled. Someone had scrawled the mission outline on a whiteboard, the ink slightly smeared from wind and sweat. She stood near the back, holding her terrain profile printout in one hand and a pen in the other, though no one asked for her input. Captain Rourke paced near the front, sleeves rolled up, pointer tapping along the marked grid. The mission was simple on paper. A convoy of 8 vehicles would depart from the plateau and follow a winding ridgeline trail south to Route Charlie. Blade 1 and Blade 2 would provide air cover, orbiting at standard Overwatch altitude. Rourke made a point to say it twice. Stay high. Keep the pattern clean. Let the Joint Terminal Attack Controllers call in close air support if things got loud. Rachel waited for the pause between points. Then she stepped forward just enough for her voice to carry clearly. That blind curve near kilometer 10 runs beneath a split ridge. Terrain fold creates shadow bloom. From altitude, you'll lose sight of the western bank. If we drop to low hover profile through that stretch, we can hold visibility on both flanks. No one responded at first. The map fluttered as the wind pressed against the tent wall. Rourke turned his head, but not all the way, like he wasn't surprised she'd spoken. Negative, he said plainly. We're not cutting corners or scraping hillsides today. We hold Overwatch at proper altitude. Stick to protocol. Rachel didn't argue. She just folded the paper slowly, creasing the printout she'd studied half the night. It didn't belong in the conversation. Not here. Not with this room. Someone near the front exhaled a quiet laugh. Another mumbled something about stunt flying. The heat made everything feel just a little slower, a little duller, like the air itself wanted her to stop trying. Rourke moved on without pause. His voice stayed smooth and confident as he detailed fallback coordinates and emergency signal frequencies. She stood in silence, one boot half shadowed by a tilted chair leg, the other pressed against a thin film of dust coating the floor. Eyes passed over her, and then away. The briefing wrapped 10 minutes later. Mission folders were left unopened on the plastic table. A few officers peeled off to check fuel lines. One of them tossed a joke back over his shoulder as he left. Blade 2 better keep it straight today. She didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up and carried the morning haze across the tarmac. Dust swirled in low spirals between the aircraft rows. The newer birds were parked up front, polished, freshly wiped. Blade 1's Apache sat close to the refuel trailer, rotors locked down and gleaming faintly in the light. Rachel's ship, Blade 2, was parked last in line, half in shadow near the gravel runout. The matte skin showed streaks where weather had worn at the coating. The longbow dome above the main rotor was dulled by sand abrasion and streaked with exhaust soot. She walked to it without calling for a ground crew. No one followed her. No one needed to. At the nose. She reached into her side pouch and pulled out a folded rag. It was already stained from a dozen other cleanings. She climbed onto the skid, leaned up on one arm, and began wiping down the gun camera optics in small circles, pressing with enough force to feel the film lift. The ship smelled like it always did. Metal warmed by sun, old hydraulic oil, the last trace of burned gun gas around the turret's recoil path. A few meters away, 2 crew chiefs were loading cases onto a maintenance cart. One of them looked over briefly. He didn't wave. She stepped back down, stowed the rag, and began checking the panels by hand. Ammunition count was within spec. Fuel line locked. External points cleared. She adjusted her flight harness herself, tugging the chest strap tight, smoothing the webbing down across her side. Her gloves were clipped to her belt loop. Her helmet was still in its case. She didn't put it on. Another pair of pilots passed behind her, laughing about something on their shared comms. One pointed toward the pad and mimicked a rotor dip. The other laughed louder. She didn't turn to look. She slid the panel latch closed, secured it, and moved toward the cockpit. By the time the others were suiting up, she was already seated inside. The cabin was dark, switches still silent. Her hands rested near the controls, fingers relaxed, elbows steady against her vest. The temperature inside was rising fast, but she didn't reach for the fan. She didn't power anything up. Not yet. Her eyes stayed forward, locked on the horizon beyond the canopy glass. She was tracing the route in her mind again. The fold at kilometer 10. The shadows that shifted as the sun crept west. The way a ridge could block visibility for exactly 6 seconds before exposing a blind spot full of rifle barrels. She pictured the pull-down angle she'd need to take the dive clean. She visualized the recovery curve. She imagined the fire line breaking beneath her blades. She saw it clearly, not because someone asked her to, but because no one else would. She sat in silence for another minute. The blades above her creaked faintly in the warming wind. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She was already flying it. The convoy rolled out just after 0730. 8 vehicles stretched along a tight serpentine trail that wound through the foothills south of Echo. The lead vehicle kicked dust high enough to hang, and by the time the second pair cleared the slope, the valley shimmered in a dry haze that bent the light sideways. Rachel stayed high, orbiting at 1,000 feet above the eastern ridge, her Apache tucked into the designated altitude lane with Blade 1 flying the western track. The sky above was clean, but the light came through hard and dry. Heat waves distorted the canyon edges, making the rocks appear to breathe. Below, the vehicles crept forward in careful intervals, barely visible through the thermal feed. Havoc. Actual kept the comms quiet and disciplined, checking in at grid intervals, confirming speed and spacing. Rachel listened without speaking. Her eyes flicked between the targeting camera, the visual overlay, and the jagged shape of the terrain unfolding beneath her. Blade 1 broke silence once with a dry joke about convoy pace. The pilot's voice was too relaxed for the terrain. Rachel didn't answer. She kept watching the ground. A pattern had started to build in the smoke, a shimmer pooling low across the valley floor. Slower than it should have been. Darker at the edges. She pressed her left palm to the inside of the cockpit frame, steadying herself as she leaned forward. Her display didn't show anything flagged, no radar contacts, no surface indicators. The canyon bend near kilometer 10 still read neutral, but the shadow was wrong. She tapped twice on the elevation overlay, but the render lagged half a second behind. The camera jittered, struggling to stabilize against the thermal bloom. That stretch of canyon had always drawn light weird in the mornings, and today it was worse. Air currents warped the rock contrast. The ridgeline to the west bled into the fold. She knew that bend. She'd marked it the night before. Havoc rolled through the curve just before 0800. The first rocket-propelled grenade came in low and left. It missed the lead vehicle and punched the dirt behind it, sending up a spray of earth. The next one found its mark. The second transport took a hit broadside. A plume of black smoke shot upward as the rear tires lifted off the ground and slammed back down. Gunfire followed half a heartbeat later, crackling down both walls of the canyon from overlapping flanks. It was organized, staggered, measured. Convoy radios lit up instantly. "This is Havoc Actual. We're hit. Contact left and right. Returning fire. Engaged on both sides." Rachel rolled hard into a descending orbit, cutting to 600 feet. The engine note deepened. Blade 1 pulled around fast from the far side, angling into a gun run. They fired short, rounds streaking down into the smoke, but the impact was wide. The angle was too shallow. They couldn't see the canyon wall beneath the ledge. A second rocket-propelled grenade spiraled from the upper eastern shelf and clipped the rearmost truck. The explosion pushed fire into the cargo bed. Marines scattered for the rocks. Shouts echoed through open comms. One voice rose above the rest. "We're boxed in, taking fire from above. Need suppression now. Where is that Apache?" Rachel dropped lower. Her heads-up display flickered under the strain. Too much interference from the smoke and heat. Automated targeting cut out. Her screen washed with digital static. The computer couldn't see what was coming. but she could. There were 3 figures tucked under the overhang at the blind corner, just below the top lip of the western ridge. Firing position: 1 launcher, 1 spotter, and another figure kneeling in cover. The rest of the ambush was noise. These 3 were aiming to finish it. Blade 1 called again. No visual on trench team. Negative on undercut. Can't see the base of the wall. The ground team was still moving, but barely. 1 Marine gunner screamed for help. We've got wounded on the west slope, still taking fire. Where's that damn Apache? Rachel slid her thumb toward the manual slew. Her finger rested near the gun paddle, but she hadn't pressed it yet. Her hand was calm. Evans looked at her. Do we wait for clearance? The heads-up display flashed again. Terrain proximity alert, rotor stall warning, torque threshold exceeded. The aircraft wanted her to back off. The system was doing its job, staying safe, staying smart, staying within the rules. She reached up, tapped the alarm off, and dropped collective. Blade 2 began to fall. Blade 2 dropped through the canyon edge like it had been cut loose. The walls pressed in fast, rough stone rising on both sides, blurred by smoke and heat shimmer. Rachel gripped the manual slewing handle with one hand and stabilized the pitch with the other. The heads-up display screamed continuously, terrain proximity flashing red across the top of the display. Engine torque alerts blinked in yellow. Rotor margin dropped to critical. Below, the enemy firing position snapped into view, a hollow cut beneath a sandstone lip, shaped by erosion and now camouflaged with a dirty tarp. 3 silhouettes, 1 standing, 1 crouched with a launcher, 1 mid-reload. They hadn't expected her to come from this low. Rachel pressed the trigger paddle once. The 30mm cannon answered with a hard, snapping thud. The first burst cut the ledge apart. Rock, heat, and bone vanished in a flash. The next pulse followed on instinct. 2 short bursts bracketing the slope, where a second pair of fighters had started to move. Smoke rolled upward and vanished into the haze. Tracer fire rose from below, stitching the air behind her. The Apache took 1 glancing hit on the underside of the tail. A warning blinked and silenced itself. The machine was holding for now. The airframe vibrated from the sustained power load, but she kept the nose steady. Her hand never left the grip. Evans shouted over the internal channel, telling her to pull up, to wait for confirmation, to stop burning fuel in a box they couldn't map. She didn't respond. Her eyes tracked the rock line ahead. The targeting system had already failed. Smoke choked the feed. Elevation overlays bounced and stuttered. She was flying on gut, now, on rhythm and memory. The canyon narrowed. She pivoted with it. The Apache leaned hard left, tail drifting close enough to kick up ash against the stone. The main rotor blades held just above the ridge lip. Rachel bled speed with a controlled yaw, lined up the next ridge mouth, and slewed the gun 3 degrees to port. Another group of fighters appeared between rock outcroppings, scrambling for cover. She fired again. The cannon's recoil jolted through the airframe. Thud, thud, thud. Bodies disappeared into shadow and smoke. 1 figure dropped prone, trying to crawl. She adjusted 1 notch right and fired once more. The rounds hit center. Movement stopped. Below her, the convoy stirred. Voices over comms started clearing up. Sharper now. Havoc actual, moving again. Rear axle mobile. Lines reassembling. Rachel looped west to cover the fallback. Rotor wash kicked debris outward in spirals. She flew low enough that the ash sucked backward into her intake. She throttled back and dropped collective. Blade 1 was still circling above, calling for visual confirmation. Rachel ignored it. The heads-up display flashed rotor strain again. She adjusted trim manually. Her hands moved fast, efficient. Her breathing stayed even. The cockpit was loud, but her thoughts weren't. Her left elbow braced against the panel, steadying the motion as the nose adjusted for another pass. Gun ready. A voice on the ground came through clear for the first time. This is Gunnery Sergeant Medina, whoever's flying that bird. Thank you. We're not dead because of you. She didn't reply. Another target popped from the tree line just beyond the western exit. She caught the movement and flipped the manual grip 2 notches left. Fired once. Thud. The figure dropped behind a boulder and didn't rise again. Evans looked at her, stunned. They said this bird couldn't run low in this terrain. They said it'd cook the turbine. She didn't look away from the canopy. They weren't flying it. She banked hard again, dipped the tail to pivot over the gravel wash. Marines were moving below now, organized, some dragging others, some returning fire with short, disciplined bursts. The rear transport rolled forward, thick with smoke, windows blown out but still crawling. Blade 1 finally came low, offering supplemental cover. It was too late. The worst was already over. Rachel dropped her bird to a hover just above the trail, tail low, guns forward. The rotors thumped in slow rhythm, scattering grit. Evans was quiet now. Everyone was. She scanned the valley again. No new heat signatures, no more tracers, just smoke curling upward, the wind pushing it east. Her Apache sat there, a wall of sound and steel holding the canyon while the last of the convoy slipped through the clearing. Her finger stayed on the paddle. The camera feed stayed steady. The system tried once more to throw a flight correction warning. She shut it off without a glance. She hovered there until the final axle cleared the bend. And she never once let go of the trigger. The air inside the cockpit thickened with heat. Warning tones continued in short intervals, softer now, like the aircraft had stopped shouting and started pleading. Rachel ignored them. The flight management system flashed its latest alert rotor strain, exceeding safe margin. Oil temperature in the red. Fuel pressure oscillating. She flew under it all, eyes steady on the valley's retreating contours. She made the second pass slower, not because she was uncertain, but because she couldn't afford to miss. The auto-stabilization feature had gone offline, and the forward-looking infrared display had died halfway through the last fire burst. Now the main camera feed lagged slightly behind real-time. The delay meant she was aiming a second too late. She compensated by memory. The canyon bend. The rock formation shaped like a hook, the gap that curved left before splitting into three. She remembered the exact range from the simulator, 100.0 meters between those ledges. She had flown it in simulations dozens of times back when no one was watching. Evans adjusted something behind her. He spoke quietly, almost out of breath. "You're under flight floor. If anyone sees this tape." "They will," she said, tightening the trim, "but they'll be alive." The Apache slid over the western cut at less than 50 feet. Wind pressed ash across the canopy. The smell of scorched dirt and cordite filtered through the vents. Her gloves were slick from sweat. The slewing grip shifted slightly in her hand. She clenched it tighter. Another warning flashed. Nose torque imbalance. Rotor instability. She rolled trim manually and compensated with foot pedals, small, steady movements that came from years of repetition. The system wasn't helping. She didn't need it. The aircraft was close to shaking itself apart. The vibration climbed into her boots, into her wrists. But she kept everything level. A final group of insurgents fired from a ridge that overlooked the convoy's southern retreat line. She spotted the muzzle flash. One fast burst followed by the awkward stagger of someone reloading. They were pinned behind a half wall of stone and dry brush. Rachel pulled left, lifted the nose 5 degrees, and fired twice. The first burst clipped the ridge lip. The second found its mark. The shapes disappeared. No movement after. A voice crackled through the comms. "Gunship. This is Havoc Actual. We are clear to roll. First column is moving. Can you hold us through?" She didn't pause. "Blade 2 is on you." She climbed just high enough to scan the exit valley. Through a rip in the smoke, she tracked the convoy's movement. Axles shifted. Engines roared. The first 2 transports pushed through a narrow defile and disappeared down the path. Evans watched the screen. "This bird won't take another pass. We're hot all over." Rachel adjusted course, drifting above the fire line. "Then we don't need another pass." The final ridge opened into low terrain with brush and outcrop cover on either side. It was the best ambush point left. If there was one last nest, it would be here. She cut throttle just enough to slow the hover drift. The wind had picked up, carrying dirt across the glass. The windscreen was streaked and dull now. She wiped a line clear with the back of her glove. then pressed her forearm into the panel and scanned again. There. Faint heat return. Right ridge. One head, then another. Maybe scouts. Maybe last shots. Evans whispered, "Rachel." Her finger hesitated on the paddle, just long enough to register the shaking in her own hand. She hadn't noticed it before. She fired once. The cannon thudded once more. Dust collapsed into shadow. No further movement. The rear guard of the convoy called up, "We're last. Crossing the marker now." Rachel steadied the nose and held hover, tail low, watching the trucks file beneath her. One by one. 6 of them. Then the final pair. The last was half-scorched, rear doors swinging open, someone inside waving a signal. She stayed above them, tracking with eyes alone. Evans didn't say anything now. There was nothing left to say. The Apache creaked slightly in the tail section. A low vibration passed through the pedals and into the seat frame. It didn't sound good. She held it anyway. Her cannon stayed down. The smoke was thinner now, wind carrying it east toward the basin. The final truck cleared the bend and dropped out of sight beyond the rocks. Rachel didn't climb. She hovered there, alone over the valley, guns forward, systems flashing, rotors straining under heat, and still holding the line. She powered nothing down, not yet. Rachel brought the Apache in low over the pad, skimming heat waves and haze. The landing gear struck gravel harder than intended. The airframe shuddered once, bounced slightly, then settled. The main rotor spun down in slow groans, each blade ticking like an old clock under pressure. The cannon was blackened. Scorch marks lined the fuselage. The longbow dome looked darker than when they had left, its dull coat now streaked with soot and rotor wash residue. The left side panel near the intake was buckled slightly from heat expansion. Dust caked every visible seam. The aircraft didn't look like it had flown a support pattern. It looked like it had clawed its way out of a fire. The ground crew moved in fast, then stopped short. One of them looked at the tail, then at the heat warning light still blinking near the nose gear. No one spoke. One reached up to tap the intake housing, then lowered his hand. Another crouched near the turret, but didn't touch it. There was nothing routine about what they were seeing. Evans climbed down first. His boots hit the dirt slow. He turned back toward the cockpit, not moving right away. He pulled off his gloves, letting them hang from one hand. He didn't look at the crew. He looked at Rachel. "I've never seen anything like that," he said. Rachel said nothing. She powered the systems down in sequence. The cockpit lights dimmed, one switch at a time. She unbuckled her harness, pulled her helmet into her lap, and sat still for a few seconds longer. The air inside the cockpit was thick and stale. The silence carried weight. When she stood, she didn't say a word. She stepped down, adjusted the gloves still clipped to her belt, and walked past the crew without comment. Her helmet stayed in her hand. She didn't put it back on. The wind picked up again. Fine sand moved across the tarmac in soft streams. The Apache sat behind her like a carcass that had survived something it wasn't meant to. Cooling rotors ticked once, then again. Somewhere in the distance, someone called for a fuel check. She didn't look back. The debriefing room was already full by the time she entered. Captain Rourke sat in the center row, arms crossed. A large screen showed the tail feed from Blade 2. The footage had already begun to replay. No one filled the silence. On screen, the canyon tilted sharply. Gun bursts fired in pairs. Terrain warnings flickered in the corner. The footage shook hard once, then recovered. Audio picked up radio fragments and clipped breathing. At one point, Evan's voice cracked across the speakers, then fell away. There was a hard thud. Then silence again. The final burst showed the last ridge clearing, smoke falling away to the left. Then the screen paused. No one spoke. A voice in the back finally said it. "You saved them. All of them." Rachel didn't shift. She stood near the wall, helmet tucked under her arm. Her voice was even. I stayed low. Captain Rourke looked at her but didn't respond. Someone near him reached for a notepad, then stopped. No one else said anything. The screen went dark. The room stayed quiet. Outside, the first convoy truck rolled in through the forward checkpoint. Its tires carried dust and pieces of char from the fire line. The right side mirror was missing. The second vehicle followed close. Window cracked. A Marine leaned out, scanning the pad, eyes sunken and still. Rachel stepped outside again, the light cutting across the courtyard in flat, dry lines. She stood just outside the awning, helmet still in her hand, boots planted on the gravel. The trucks kept coming. Most were damaged. None were silent. The engines made noise, but the men inside didn't. They stared at the pad, at the longbow, at the gun housing scorched black. Some said nothing. Some leaned against the doors and just looked. One of them climbed out and stepped onto the gravel. He wore a torn vest and carried his rifle slung tight across his chest. He looked directly at her and brought his hand up to salute. He didn't drop it. He held it there. Another stepped off the second truck and followed. Then two more. Within a minute, there were 7 of them, all standing, all silent, their salutes steady and slow. The wind pushed dust past their boots. Rachel didn't lift her hand. She nodded once, barely a motion, then turned away. The wind shifted again. As she crossed the open gravel back toward the pad, the rotor wash from another Apache spun in the far row. A crew chief called out numbers behind her. Someone was laughing, distant, not related. Rachel kept walking. Her boots hit uneven stone. Dust clung to her sleeves. Her helmet swung loosely in one hand. The cannon on her bird had stopped glowing, but the marks on it weren't going anywhere. She reached the side panel and placed her hand on the frame once. Not to fix or check, just to feel the metal. Then she kept walking. The playback room at Forward Outpost Echo was dim and sealed tight, the kind of quiet space usually reserved for legal reviews or aircraft mishap boards. 3 officers sat in the front row, backs straight, not speaking. A 4th monitored the screen from the side table, flipping between feeds. The tail camera footage from Blade 2 had already started its 3rd loop. No one interrupted. Gunfire echoed softly through the speakers. The view shifted hard left. Heads-up display overlays flashing red with terrain warnings. Rotor load alerts spiked. Altitude dropped well below recommended flight floor. The targeting reticle pulsed once, failed, then disappeared. No automated lock. No system confirmation. Then the cannon fired. Each burst hit center. Ridge outcroppings vanished into impact flash. The feed shook from recoil, recovered, then swept low across the trench line. The angle of descent pushed into negative pitch. 20 feet, then 15. One more dive. Then a pivot so sharp the camera blurred. Warnings stacked. Oral tones overlapped. Yet the aircraft held. The only voice captured in the cockpit was Rachel's. Calm. Direct. Short calls to adjust heading. A confirmation of visual. The rest was mechanical. Each command carried with a pilot's rhythm, not volume. Angle of attack -6, rounds complete, Blade 2 exiting canyon. The screen froze on the final frame. The cannon still forward, smoke clearing, the ground quiet. One of the analysts leaned closer to his display. He rewound the telemetry feed and checked it again, then again. His voice came out quieter than before. She shouldn't have made that pullout. The torque strain alone should have snapped the mast. The numbers don't hold. The senior officer beside him didn't look up. He stared at the frozen image, then reached for his pen without writing anything. Then update the math. There was no commentary after that. Rachel's name was added to the mission log as flight lead, confirmed save count full convoy. Aircraft condition borderline structural. Notes flagged for review. But no one asked for a commendation draft. No one typed up a press line. The tape didn't require embellishment. Outside, the sun dragged low across the pad. Rachel stood by her Apache with the side panel open, checking the optical rails by hand. Her gloves were tucked in her back belt loop. One of the lower fairings had started to warp slightly from heat exposure. She tapped it twice, then brushed off the soot with her palm. She worked slow, not out of exhaustion, out of intent. The bird was still flyable, but just barely. The streaks across the cowling were permanent now. She hadn't touched the paint, hadn't asked for a scrub. The burn trail from the cannon still ran in a dark smear along the housing. She climbed the footrail, checked the turret housing, then wiped a line of ash from the windshield with the edge of her sleeve. Her face was quiet, not tense, not relaxed either, just still. Boots shifted on the gravel behind her. "Ma'am?" The voice came from a younger pilot, fresh, by the look of his harness. He stood with a notepad half tucked into his thigh pocket and one glove still clutched awkwardly in his hand. He cleared his throat once before continuing. "I reviewed the gun tape from the western ridge. That descent, where you took the bend under the split ridge. Would you walk me through how you managed the offset trim without bleeding rotor margin?" Rachel turned her head just slightly. She looked at him for a long second. The breeze moved between them. The smell of hot oil and scorched grit still clung to the underside of the aircraft. She gave one nod. "Bring a pencil." He didn't say anything else, just nodded and stepped back. Rachel turned again toward the Apache. She reached into her knee pocket and pulled out the folded terrain sheet she had carried the whole week. The ridgeline was marked in red pencil, estimated firing positions in blue, descent angles, rotor clearance ranges, and escape arcs drawn in black. It wasn't a display piece, it was a working map, the same one she had tried to hand out at the mission brief. She pressed the page against the cowling and traced a fingertip across the ridgeline. The metal was still warm. She let her hand rest there a moment longer. Behind her, the pad was quiet. The convoy route to the south had returned to stillness. No engines, no movement, just the faint wind-curling smoke against the rocks, the kind that lingers after everything important has already happened. No one spoke over the comms. No one called her name. There would be no formal brief, no interview. Just the facts in the flight record, just the tape. She folded the map again, slid it back into her pocket, picked up a rag and wiped a streak from the housing, and said nothing at all.